Hello, this is Dr. Parikh, and today I'm walking you through completing the emotional intelligence measure. We're using the TEIQue. I don't really understand. It's a very cute little acronym here, but it is the Trait Emotional Intelligence questionnaire, I assume. And it's a measure of emotional intelligence. I really wanted to move it later in the semester because it's kind of complicated. But I think that, in conjunction with the book, this is probably the best time to do it. So rather than fielding a million emails, I'm making one video to walk you through the steps and the resources that I'm going to give you. The first file is a PDF that explains what the measure is. And it lists the 15 facets that it's measuring. This is trait, which in terms of measures, you have state and trait. State means how I'm feeling right now. Trait means how I tend to function as a person. Now, trait can change, but it tends to change over, more like years, whereas state can be day-to-day changes. Both can be useful to know, but with emotional intelligence, it's really meant to be a long-term stable measure, much like our typical intelligence measures, like cognitive intelligence. It's meant to stay fairly stable, especially once you hit adolescence or adulthood. So this talks about what emotional intelligence is, and then it also defines each of these subscales. Now, even though the book talks a little bit about emotional intelligence, every scale is sort of defining emotional intelligence for itself. And so they walk you through what each thing means, what high scores mean, what low scores mean, and it gives you examples of what sorts of things people with those kinds of scores do or don't do. So this is an overview. You might want to look at it briefly, but honestly, you'll probably come back to it once you have your own scores to really give meaning to the different interpretations. If you want, you can pick a few scales and guess how you'll perform to see how well you know yourself. Next is the measure itself. It's a bit of a beast. It's 153 questions. You don't need to complete these questions at the end. Those are demographics. I'm not collecting the data from you. And I highly recommend printing it out. You could look at the screen and then there's an Excel sheet that you're going to copy your answers into. You could read number one, copy the answer. But honestly, in measures this long, it's so easy to get your numbering off, and just switching tasks, the likelihood of you putting a number in the wrong place, getting off by one, and really just messing up your data, it's pretty high. So I highly recommend printing it out. I actually, for something like this, I use one of the extra pages sideways to cover the rows I've already finished, so I'll move it down every few rows. You want to take this in sort of a quiet, calm environment so you can think. You don't want to think too hard about any one question, but you want to try to give the most honest answer. And remember, there's 153 questions because they're testing each area with several questions. So if you get one answer just a little off, it's still going to get a pretty good sense of how you generally respond. So here's an Excel file. It's very important that you use the Excel file that's there, that's in Blackboard, because I got it from the TEIQue, I don't know how they say their acronym, but the Trait Emotional Intelligence Questionnaire people. And so for reasons you'll see in a minute, you need to use this specific file. And it just goes question one. And you can see here, there's a file that I've already finished with my real data, where it goes up to 153, and you just put in your number underneath. And I believe you could run several people at the same time, but there's no reason to. So fill in your numbers into the Excel file. Save it. I just save it on my computer in an easy to find place with my name. And then we come over to the website. This is the people, the psych lab that have built this measure. So scoring it. And you can see they do have instructions to walk you through, and they have made it so that you can just automatically upload. You're using the 153 form, but you don't really need to know that. Just hit browse. I'm on a Mac, so my stuff is going to show up like a Mac, but it should be pretty similar. If I were taking this, and probably when I originally took it, I probably just saved it to my desktop to make things easy to find. But wherever you can find it easily, upload it and then hit calculate results. And it is going to tell you your results. And for some reason, this stuff, the alphas are not turning out. I suspect that those are things where you need multiple people to calculate the alphas, because that's a statistical term. Let me increase the size on this a little bit so you can see for each measure, I am given a number. And you can see kind of what's relatively low and relatively high. I'm just kind of getting this so that it's a little easier to see all at once. That's still not quite there. One thing that I recommend is to kind of convert these things to make it a little easier to see. You can convert it to a number. And then let's see, convert to number. And yeah, well, let's just do 1 decimal place for now. So we can see now, let's see, and let's make these just a little bit bigger so I can see, and then I'll also wrap the text. So let's see, emotion regulation and assertiveness came out as my lowest. And so you can go back to your PDF and you can look and see what that means. So you can see emotion regulation. This scale measures short, medium, and long-term control of one's own feelings and emotional states. And let's see, low scores are subject to emotional seizures and periods of prolonged anxiety or even depression. They find it difficult to deal with their feelings and are often moody and irritable. And I scored right in the middle for that. So it's not necessarily a really, really low score. It's just the lowest one I have. It's a little lower, sorry, it's over here. It's a little lower than half. And in general, this is consistent with my results. I have really high emotions. My highs are high, my lows are lows. And I struggle particularly with anxiety at times. Assertiveness is my next lowest. So let's find that, which is listed in no apparent order. So low scores tend to back down even if they know they're right and have difficulty saying no, even when they feel they must. As a result, they often end up doing things they do not want to do. In most cases, they prefer to be part of a team rather than to lead it. And this is where part of knowing how to interpret results can be very important. Because in some ways, this result is really true. I don't like high conflict things. I have a hard time watching, for example, news or political shows where it's a lot of people arguing. That doesn't go well for me. And in general, in conversations, I look for common ground. I'll often sort of not disagree out of politeness. And then also I have a hard time saying no to people, or particularly asking for discounts or saying that things haven't been completed to my satisfaction. So when it comes to things like negotiating big ticket items or doing anything related to car maintenance, I usually try to get my husband to do it, because if I go do it, I might be okay with it, but he isn't okay with the price I got or the service I got. At the same time, so all of that being said, I also think that I have devalued my assertiveness over the last few years, because growing up in the Midwest, there is much more of an emphasis on smoothing things over or fitting in than there is on the East Coast. There's a lot less bargaining in general, and there's less suspiciousness of like con artists. It's a lot more small towns where the reputation is pretty important. Not to say that you can't get scammed in the Midwest, but I think it's a little less in our mindset to be constantly on the lookout for scammers. And also, I think that part of it is influenced by, so part of it's influenced by me now living in New Jersey, which is a much higher conflict, higher assertiveness area than what I grew up in. And so I'm constantly feeling like a fish out of water. And then there's also, then culturally, I come from white American culture, and I'm married into Asian Indian culture, who all live in New Jersey. And so there's a lot more conflict and assertiveness, I believe, in Indian culture. And so I'm constantly comparing myself with people who I think are probably highly assertive. And in general, I do say no a good bit. I work hard. It's an effort for me. I'm naturally quite a people pleaser, but it's something that I put a lot of effort into and have made a lot of progress on. So this is where we get into a measure is only as good as the data put into it. And in some ways, I think I give myself a hard time on assertiveness. So I am somewhat low in assertiveness, but I also think that I evaluate myself pretty hard. And I think to some extent, a similar thing happens with emotion regulation, because I know that this is something that tests have told me before is an issue, and I know that I tend to run kind of anxious or I'll get down. But I think in some ways I've kind of labeled myself, and that might affect the way that I respond. Let's look at some of the high ones. Let's see. Happiness is very high, and emotional expression, those two look like my highest. So happiness, high scores are cheerful and feel good about themselves. So although I have a lot of ups and downs, I overall say, yeah, I'm pretty happy. And, you know, part of this gets into state versus trait. Remember I said before that state is how I'm feeling right now, and it might be different tomorrow. And trait is how I feel over the long term. Now, this is saying that over the long term, I feel pretty good about my life, about myself, about the way things are going. And I think this is probably pretty true. At the same time, if you see a low score on emotion regulation and a high score on happiness, you might say, maybe I caught this person with high highs and low lows on a bad day. Or maybe you would see, so emotion regulation here actually doesn't say much about, it doesn't say much about the high highs. It just talks about emotional seizures and prolonged anxiety or even depression. And so perhaps my experience as someone with emotion regulation low but happiness high might be very different from someone with low emotion regulation and low happiness. And so you can think about strengths as well as weaknesses, and thinking about how your strengths can balance out those weaknesses. That, you know, I have periods where life is kind of hard for me to process, but overall I tend to bounce back to a good place. Or again, you can think about, you know, this person tends to have ups and downs, so even though they say overall they're really happy, that doesn't mean that they always feel happy, and they might still benefit from some interventions, some things to help them handle those emotions, handle that anxiety. Let's see, and the other emotional expression. Let's see, where would that be? Right up here. High scores on this scale mean people are fluent in communicating their emotions to others. If I wasn't before, 10 plus years of training to become a psychologist certainly helped. They know what the best words are for expressing their feelings accurately and unambiguously. So I'm typically very clear with my emotions, and it is something I think I've always been self-reflective. I've always been kind of in tune with myself, but certainly my training to be a counseling psychologist helped me develop that much more strongly. And also, for me, it's a way to cope with the ups and downs. This roller coaster is to be able to name it so I can deal with it. And so when you think about your emotional intelligence, you can really think about a mix of what's easy for you, what's hard for you, and how can you use those different things to balance them out. One more that I see, 4.5, self-control. So that's another one where it is a lower score for me, but it's also my perception, and I tend to be a perfectionist. And so self-control, low scores are prone to impulsive behavior and seem to be incapable of managing stress, associated with inflexibility. I do have some issues with flexibility sometimes. It's hard for me. But at the same time, I mean, I have a PhD. It's not an easy thing to do. And to some extent, you know, this is possibly a mix of, because my emotions run really hot, even though I work really hard to control, it's still a struggle for me. It also could be partly very sort of my expectations being unrealistically high. So anytime you're interpreting things, it's a mix. I would say look at your results, take them in, and then set them aside for a few days and go back to them. Feedback is hard. You can probably hear a little bit in what I'm saying that I'm trying to excuse some of these things and say, no, these aren't really weaknesses. And maybe some of what I'm saying is true, and maybe some of it is me just kind of resisting or explaining away. But either way, it's useful to think, you know, even if what I take from this self-control score is, geez, I'm really hard on myself. I need to, you know, have more reasonable expectations of myself. That's not a bad thing to take away. But it's always important, don't just take your results at face value. Try to make them make sense. If something seems really off, go back and check. You may have put in a number wrong that changes a scale drastically. You might have misread one of the questions. Doing measures well is extremely hard. All right, if you have any extra questions, if it's really simple, you can email me. But honestly, this is a little bit of a complicated beast, and giving feedback on it is definitely complicated. So your best bet is to ask me in class or in office hours. All right, thanks. Bye-bye.